We have Joe Reagan on our panel, guys.
Let's
Yay.
go. LFG. All right,
Hold
cool.
on.
Well, thank you so much
for
for your persistence and your tenacity. That's what it's all about sometimes. I am telling you, right? We don't give up.
That's true. And especially when you're in politics, you got to be able to adapt quickly.
Yes, and you have quite a background of adaptation, I'm sure. Real quick then, we'll do a couple of just introductory ones and then we'll kind of get into the meat of it. So tell me about somebody that you admire, and that could be somebody in the past, present, or even fictional character. What values do they hold and what do you admire most about them?
You know, I think that's maybe because it was D-Day just the other day, but I have spent a lot of time thinking about Dwight Eisenhower. And I know he's a Republican, and I know he started the military-industrial complex, but on the 20th anniversary of D-Day, he went back to Normandy. And as he was walking through the U.S. military cemetery there, as he's looking at it on the headstones, he looked at me and he said, "They bought us time." And I thought that that was just a really insightful moment. Something that we need more of is to recognize the fact that we are an imperfect nation. We've never been perfect, in that we're not going to get to solve all the problems in our lifetime, but we can push ourselves just a little bit further to the other, towards progress.
I love that. It's insightful. All right. So my second question is, you have a documentary that's coming out. It's called Joe's Running for Congress. And so I would like to know who or what inspired that project and how did it develop into reality? And then finally, where and when can it be viewed?
Yeah, so it is available on YouTube right now. So if you follow any of the Reagan for Colorado socials, you can get the link to YouTube and find that. It was motivated by, I think, a couple of things. First of all, of course, Mamdani did a very similar documentary going into his mayoral race. But personally, when we were having the decision to do something like this, it really came down to so much of politics today is about those 90-second sound bites. And we tend to break it up into, issue-based. Right? How do you tell me in 90 seconds how you feel about healthcare? Well, that's not how people experience healthcare. People don't experience healthcare in 90-second sound bites. People experience healthcare in months and months of caring for a loved one as their health declines. It's working through the hospice process and seeing the challenges of people facing when they can't get access to quality healthcare because their financial situation is dictating their healthcare decisions. And so what we wanted to do is to bring people in and have them talk not about policy, but to be able to talk about their lived experience and what that looked like. Because I think that's how people are connecting to folks. And as a nation, as a community, we've really pushed away from this idea of having these really just brief sound bites. People want to understand who these candidates are as people, what makes us think. Because I think for many people, I mean, as one member of Congress, it's not like I'm always going to get my way. And so what's almost more important than understanding my ideal situation is how do I think about problems and how do I approach that, and more important, and who am I going to surround myself with? Because I think that could be a much better way of thinking through how is it that I'm going to make decisions in office that represent the needs of our community and not the needs of special interest.
So that leads me, that's a perfect segue to my next two questions. The first one would be one I'm borrowing from Steve, which is tell us about the, quote, average, if there is one, constituent in your district. What do they look like? What's their age, their demographic, that you think you'll mostly be representing?
Yeah. So first of all, we have 100,000 military veterans in El Paso County, about 40,000 military families here as well. So literally everyone in our community is impacted by our military here, 5 military installations in El Paso County alone. And so for me, that fits into understanding the fact that with that type of military connection, so much of my post-military career has been spent serving our veteran community as well, both here in Colorado as well as across the country. And so recognizing how we can utilize those resources to be able to impact the rest of our community. I think about healthcare as an example of this, where you have this idea of bringing in new hospital resources, and how do we make sure that for serving veterans that we're alleviating pressure on the other areas as well. So We also have, like I said, we have in Colorado, a strong Latino population that often doesn't show up to vote. And so we need to make sure that we're engaging those Black and brown communities as well to make sure that they are being engaged and represented as well. Just the other day, we were talking this Pride Month, and we were talking about the fact that, unfortunately, Colorado Springs, for all the things that we could be known for, we have a real history of being anti-LGBTQ+. And I do think that we need representation to be able to stand up and say, no, we are, in fact, a loving community that does embrace our LGBTQ community, and we want to be there for them. And as a representative, making sure that their voices are heard and that we're bringing that up as well.
I love that. Yeah. And I don't know, want to make a bad assumption, but have you gone to any of the No Kings over there on the west side of town? I mean, your office is on the west side of town. Yeah, so you've been there. I see a lot of representation over there, but it does seem like there's a split demographic between the east side and the west side of the county.
Yes.
Quite a bit.
East side, west side.
Yeah.
Well, then we get the north side too. Yeah, so I've been to all the different No King rallies. We've also had our Indivisible group has hosted a number of empty chair town halls going back almost 2 years ago. So I've been running for this seat for now over 2.5 years, and have been part of that movement from the very beginning. I think that was one thing that we saw with this being, having a representative that doesn't show up in the community, that I wanted to be the opposite of that. I wanted to be the person that was everywhere and all over and attending as many of these events as that we could get ourselves into. Yeah,
I love that. And so I want to ask real quick, this wasn't on my list, but it kind of made me think about the very religious aspect of the county. It's there's a lot of religious, I guess, denominations, probably churches on almost every other block kind of thing. So how do you feel like that is playing a part in the current political climate, both with regard to recognizing like LGBTQ plus communities and, things like separation of church and state?
Yeah. So, and let's separate the fact that we have a Christian nationalism sect here in Colorado, in the Colorado area, that is trying to infringe on our schools and our school curriculum. And that's different from what we see in some other aspects of our religious community that does actually believe in a lot of the things that we want to see. And like I said, I was raised Catholic. And so for me, seeing what that push and Republicans try to capture this idea of, well, this is what Christianity is about. It's like, no, I've read this book, and this is not what we're talking about. When you read the Beatitudes, read the Sermon on the Mount, and the sorts of policies that we should be putting forward should be about compassion and understanding and love. And that is not what we're seeing from the Christian nationalist side of things, which is pushing for exclusion and anti-diversity.
So are you finding that people are hearing what you have to say, your side of that message? Do you feel like they're receiving it pretty well?
I would think so. I think we've had a lot of different areas. One of the things that we've done differently in the campaign is we talk a lot about meeting voters where they're at. And I think that in El Paso County, you see a lot of people that will describe themselves as socially liberal but fiscally conservative. And so then how do we talk about those issues and create a vision that says, listen, this is what we're actually promoting. And, I think when I was watching earlier, you were talking about how Democrats have been succeeding in a lot of these special elections. And that's something that here we've got to understand that performance in other districts doesn't also always translate into a blue wave along down the line. So when we're meeting voters where they're at, how are we having those conversations around things like making sure that we're supporting small businesses, making sure that we're engaging with people, and how the healthcare discussion has to go and affect that bottom line. So it's those sorts of things that when we start and go back to the conversation around the documentary, that's the way we try and phrase things is tying it back to the lived experiences of people here in El Paso County and make it super local. And as someone that serves in the nonprofit, I've been in the nonprofit community for over a decade now, this is exactly the experience that I'm bringing to Washington, is someone that has been on the ground where policy meets the road and sees where those things fall through. And so when we go out and we talk to people, having that connection with the lived experiences is so much better.
Yeah, I saw a lot of comments when you did that town hall with Jessica Killen, who is your Democratic opponent. There were a lot of comments in the chat about your presence and your living in the area, and that meant a lot to people. And I think that does resonate with a lot of people. So another thing that a lot of constituents seem to be concerned about these days is how you are being funded. So tell us about how your campaign is being funded. Are you taking money from corporations, PACs?
So no corporate PAC money, no APAC money. We've really tried to run a truly grassroots effort. And what that means is over 80% of our donors are here in El Paso County. So the folks that are supporting this campaign financially are the same people that are going to start voting for me this afternoon. And that, I think, is a huge component of it. And we underestimate. So first of all, I believe that we need to reverse Citizens United, 100%. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have with Citizens United is it also caused us to forget how powerful our voices can be when we use them. Right? Republicans wanted Citizens United because they knew they could never compete with our voices. And so they needed money to overwhelm that. And we still have that power. I've worked very closely with our local labor unions to help elevate them in the work that they're doing. And I'm proud to be endorsed by the Teamsters to have them to help be part of that elevating of their voices, because I think that that's one of those areas that we can push back on and say, it's not all about money. And look at when we make change, right? AOC was outspent like 6-1 in her first race. Mary Peltola in Alaska was outspent. Mamdani was outspent. We don't have a Mayor Cuomo because of the fact that it was about grassroots mobilization and efforts where we're able to make those connections with voters and focus on what matters here. And I am very proud of the fact, like I said, those people that are supporting the campaign are my friends and neighbors that I'm seeking to represent.
So you are, like I said, your Democratic opponent is Jessica Killen, and it seems like, is she the Democratic endorsed candidate, or are you also? I mean, how are they working on endorsements between the two of you?
Yeah, so she has picked up the endorsements of the Democratic establishment. I mean, her career she's been in Washington for 25 years as a lobbyist, and moved back here less than a year ago to be part of this election. And, and I think it's not taking anything away from her career and the success that she's had, but it's about the connections that she's able to build with the community, and the fact that when you're sitting in Washington for 20, 25 years, are you really connected to the community that you're trying to represent, or are you really just representing the special interest groups that you've been working alongside throughout the course of your career?
So what, other than the funding, or like you said, the lack of just being present in the community, what is the biggest contrast between you and her? Because I will just say, after watching the Indivisible YouTube town hall, many of your questions were pretty much on par with one another. There wasn't a huge contrast that I noticed, and that's why I have a couple more questions lined up for you. But what would you say is the biggest contrast between you and her?
Right. And so I think when you're talking about a Democratic primary, keeping in mind that in that 2-minute span, a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about, that vision is going to be very similar. And the difference between the two of us comes into that whole idea of where is the nuance and where is the rest of the policy understanding coming from. And so when you look at, and again, that's why we focused a lot on the long form conversations, to be able to go more in depth on some of these things. Right? There's multiple different ways that you can approach universal health care. So how do you actually intend to do that, and what are you looking at to be a practical exercise to be able to get us to that point where someone's financial situation isn't actually going to define their healthcare decisions? And so for me, that's exactly what I represent, right? I've advocated for policies not based on what's happening with special interest groups. I'm advocating for programs are overly complicated, or they require too many hurdles, or they don't actually address the underlying issue. And that's the sort of experience that I'm bringing to the picture of saying, hey, listen, the people that are in Washington that are driving policy for the past 20, 30 years and beyond, they're not the ones that are actually out there living these experiences. They're not the ones that are engaging with our unhoused neighbors and talking to them about how they work their way into that situation. And so there's that sort of a very pragmatic, very practical, very on-the-ground experience that I think sets me apart, because those are the voices that have gone unheard for too long in Washington.
Okay, so I would agree with that as somebody who's really paying attention. I consider myself to be fairly in tune with what's going on politically, and I know that I have a lot of political homework to do once I move to the new district. But there are admittedly a lot of voters who are not very tuned in, who still are living comfortably enough to not pay very much attention. And so, as you pointed out earlier, those are probably the people who may have voted for Jeff Crank. Those are the people who may have voted for who we have in the White House right now, because they listened to those 30-second sound bites. And I'm going to 30 seconds because honestly, that's as short as it is their attention span. So are you addressing those 30-second soundbite people as well? And if so, how are you doing that?
Yes. So Here's an interesting statistic about the district. So in the last election cycle, 54% of El Paso County voters voted to enshrine a woman's right to choose into our state's constitution. 42% voted for the Democratic pro-choice candidate for Congress. That's 12% of voters that voted to enshrine a woman's right to choose in our state's constitution, but did not vote for the pro-choice candidate. And so that's the target audience that we've been trying to focus on. And when you talk to them, these are the people that are really fed up with both parties. And so engaging with them directly and saying, this is why we need someone that is not part of the Democratic Party establishment. We need a true local leader. And we've got to be able to build trust with those folks. These are folks that are struggling with, you talk about, I think you used the word comfort. And I would argue that a lot of voters that are misinformed or not able to give a lot of effort into doing all the research that needs to be done to really flesh out what the candidates stand for. It's not because they're comfortable, it's because they're busy. I mean, I've got 2 kids and I'm constantly on the move trying to keep them from place to place to place. And all of us who get busy in life. And I talk to voters every day. And that's the same conversation. I just spoken to one woman today and she's like, I would love to talk to you for 20 minutes, but I'm about to go pick up my kids from day camp. And I don't have time to do that right now. Yeah. And so one of the ways that we've done that, go back to grassroots mobilization strategy, we've knocked over 15,000 doors in El Paso County in the past couple months alone. And we still have 30 days left till primary. So as we continue that momentum, we'll be able to get out there and continue to engage people one-on-one. I think one of my critiques with the local party is only 16% of El Paso County voters are registered Democrats. We have the majority of people here are unaffiliated voters. And so one of the things that you have to understand too is when we talk about meeting voters where they're at, it's actually going into their spaces and recognizing the fact that people that aren't politically engaged are engaged in the community elsewhere, which is why I've been very active in our local Rotary Club that puts me in touch with hundreds of people across the community doing actual work that people can see. A lot of the work that I've been doing in Veterans Affairs puts me in rooms with so many different people that are engaged in the work of our community, but not actually engaged in talking the political side. And that's where you start to build in those trust areas. That's where you start to build in all those components of how do you get someone where folks look at that and say, I'm voting for that person, not because they're a Democrat, not because they're a Republican, but because I know them and I've seen the impact that they are able to have in our community. And what's been really cool about this campaign is we've had Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliated electeds that sit there and say, for the Republicans at least, they'll say, Joe, we don't like that you're a Democrat, but we know you're someone that we can work with because you've demonstrated your ability to work with people across the aisle to be able to do it. And so that's the way that you build trust with these folks. It's not just about political advertising. And of course, we're doing the advertising. We've got a huge social media presence that we've been pushing out as well. But that's what we mean when we talk about meeting voters where they're at, both in terms of how you talk about issues and where you're meeting those voters physically.
Okay, so I promised myself I wasn't going to get into a Jen advice moment, but I can't help myself here. I agree with you 100%. It is about seeing the work being done and trusting that the work's going to be done. But I think what I'm seeing, and I'm coming from California, and I just watched this in the gubernatorial race here, which was a huge one that the whole nation had their eyes on because of the contributions that California makes to the rest of the nation. And what I saw, and I would love for your team to kind of just take this as a bug in the ear moment, is that exactly like what you said. However, it does also need to take the form of the 30-second sound bites, and it needs to be taken in the form of people in those videos saying it to other people, not the candidate saying, I'm best for you. It's seeing the teachers say, Joe is best for you and here's why. It's seeing the union workers say, Joe is best for you and here's why, because we've been working with them. It's the veterans saying those things. So when people hear it from other people that they relate to, it means more than hearing it from a candidate. However, I have seen really good candidates fall very, very far by the wayside because their social media game was not up to par. So I would just say, like I said, food for thought moment.
No, you're 100% right. 100% right.
So Jen, I have a question from the chat, and I believe somebody from Joe's team kind of answered it. But is it only mail-in voting in Colorado? We were speaking yesterday, last night, because I'm in New Jersey. New Jersey has like universal mail-in voting, but you can still vote in person. You can still, go early vote. It's just an added option.
So every voter in Colorado will have a ballot mailed to them. And so you will get a physical ballot. If you are an unaffiliated voter, you will get both of those, both the Republican and the Democratic ballot, and you can return one. And so you can either mail that ballot back in through the U.S. mail, and it's not a postmark. It has to be at the county clerk's office before June 30th. We also have drop boxes across the city where you just go and you put your ballot back into that specialized mailbox. And each one of those, by the way, for those that are curious, all of those are video monitored. So you can actually, if you are really curious and you want to see what's happening at your ballot box, you can actually go online. You can watch the activity at all the different ballot boxes across our county. And then we do. Coming in about 2 weeks, they'll start to open up the voter service centers. And so say, for example, you are a new person that's just moved to Colorado and you haven't got the mail ballot. You can go in, you can present your ID, you can get a physical ballot, and you can cast it right there. Or maybe you're like me, and the ballot was sitting on the kitchen table and one of the kids spilled milk and now the ballot got ruined. So you go to the voter service center, you get a new ballot, you can cast it in person as well.
And you should bring that spoiled ballot with you, right?
Yes, you don't have to. They're really good about it. And the way that on the back end of this, what's really impressive and why Colorado has the gold standard on voting and election security is that at every stage, it's the ballot is tracked to the individual. So this morning, I got an email that said, your ballot got mailed today. And tomorrow, it's going to say your ballot is in your mailbox. And then when I send it back in, usually by the end of the day, I'll get a note that says, hey, your ballot was received and it's being processed. And then I'll get another one that says your vote was counted. And so all that way, you're getting those images along the way, so you know exactly where your ballot is. And it also, because at the same time, it's being tracked of who's voting, when are they voting, and where did that vote get cast. So it's preventing people from potentially voting twice.
Perfect. So since we are on the topic of voting, I can't remember if this was a question in your town hall before, but the subject of Tina Peters. Can you please lend us just a very general, doesn't have to be too in-depth thought of what transpired? And for those of you who don't know, Tina Peters in Colorado, she was found guilty of basically election interference. Okay, I'll just leave it at that. And so she was jailed, and I call it the regime. I'm sorry, Joe, if this offends anybody. I refuse to call it an administration. The regime has been pressuring Colorado in a number of ways and has basically been punishing Colorado for not letting her go free and not for not pardoning her. The federal government could not pardon her because it was a state crime. So Colorado, up until recently, has been resisting that and said, no, no, she broke the law, she's going to stay in jail. Recently, the governor did commute her time, right? So he didn't give her a full pardon, but he commuted her time. She is out now. And there have been a lot of feelings about that. So please share with us your feelings.
Right now, the number one issue that Democrats are running on is holding this administration accountable for its violations of the law and the Constitution. And how are we supposed to do that when an election official who was convicted of a jury of her peers is being let go early for one of the most egregious crimes that we can think of when it comes to having faith in our election system? And if you don't know this, by the way, when Tina Peters was brought up on charges, she was brought up on charges by a Republican district attorney that actually did the investigation and led the criminal prosecution. And that was between Phil Weiser, who's our attorney general, and the local DA. They had that conversation, and they decided, no, it's best that this be prosecuted by a Republican so that this is not seen as something that was politically motivated. There has been a crime committed. The investigation showed through the facts and convicted by a jury of her peers that she violated the law. She did the exact thing that the Trump administration talks about, is tampering with our elections. We cannot be. How are we going to be taken seriously as Democrats if we're going to let that slide?
So, do you have an opinion about because I do understand that there have been bills there was a bill that was vetoed by the president, right? There was a bipartisan bill for clean water moving throughout the state. In my opinion, Colorado has been punished for about a year in various ways because of the refusal to grant some leniency to Tina. Do you feel that the decision had anything to do with that, or do you have an opinion on why it was done at this point?
I don't know why the governor decided to do it. And you are right that we have been punished not only for the veto of the Clean Water Act for Southern Colorado, which, by the way, our Republican representative refused to work with his fellow Republican that passed the bill. Lauren Boebert was the one that championed that bill to bring clean water to Colorado. And that's not the way it should be, right? When it comes to bringing clean water to Colorado, it's not a Democrat or Republican issue. That's something we should all be working together to make sure that we're doing. Also, if you look at how we support small business, some of our small business development programs have not been funded in over 6 months because of for the same reason. By the way, there's only 3 states in the country that's happening. It's Colorado, Minnesota, and Illinois. Something in common there.
Shocker. Yeah, I wonder what that commonality might be. Okay, real quick about the DNC leadership, and this has been another hot topic for a lot of in-tune voters. What structural changes do you believe need to be made to achieve the goals that truly represent constituents rather than corporate or establishment leadership?
So we already talked about Citizens United and making sure that we repeal that. We need broad-scale ethics reform across the entirety of government. I mean, the executive branch does have a fairly robust ethics rule, a series of ethics rules that obviously have not been enforced whatsoever, but within the legislature, right? Members of Congress should not be trading individual stocks. They should not be the ones that are able to go there and make millions off of essentially what is insider trading. And I think that you need to have far greater transparency both in Congress as well as within the judiciary to be able to promote that sort of confidence that decisions are being made not because I potentially stand to financially benefit from it, but because of the fact that we're making those decisions because it's going to be best for our constituents. I think you've seen some interesting pieces. I think like Hawaii did pass some legislation around reestablishing how corporations can be done. And the unfortunate reality, though, is that those corporations are just going to shift their headquarters outside of Hawaii. They'll do like the Delaware thing, and they'll get around that as well. So I think those are some of the systematic reforms you see at kind of the basic level.
And then how about within the Democratic Party itself? Because I guess what I'm really aiming for is that there's been complaints, again, from those of us who are in tune with what's going on. There is a clear headbutting going on between the more progressive movement of the party and the more establishment part of the party. So I guess that's kind of where I was going with that.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we've got to look at the party level too is one, enforcing that sort of the transparency component of it, right? So the Democratic Party did an entire investigation as to why we lost the last election and then refused to send it out there. Again, how are we supposed to go to voters and make the case that we're a party of more transparency and then hide those sorts of things? So we do need those leaders that are also not only willing to accept criticism and share it publicly, but be willing to bring in new voices into leadership. Like you look at folks like David Hogg that was pushed out of the party leadership because of the fact that he was disagreeing. Right? We can't have that. I think primaries are an important space for us to be able to push back. And we've got to recognize the fact that it's not us being mean to one another. It's us sharing and pushing the party in different directions. And that's the messiness that is democracy. I believe really strongly in promoting ranked choice voting. I think that when you look at where the primary problem where so often we push people to both polar opposite sides of the party and don't really give people an opportunity to recognize who really is the candidate that we want most. And so when you look at areas like, again, Maine and Alaska that utilize ranked choice voting, it provides voters with more opportunities to say, this is my preference. This is who I want to see in office. And I think that's something that we should certainly explore more too.
I have another question from the chat. What do you think of Congress's present leadership? And I think what they mean is Democratic leadership versus and Republican leadership.
Yeah, I think that they relied too heavily on believing that we could go and just say, well, this is how things normally function. We have seen a higher use of the discharge petition as a means to be able to push back on that. And I think that's continued to be an effective tool. But look at the first government shutdown where, I mean, there were some high demands there and Democratic leadership just decided to cave. And in a community, and believe me, I understand this because in a community with so much government work happening, that shutdown really hurt a lot of our friends and neighbors. And I think what they looked at it of saying, obviously they didn't like the pain of not getting a paycheck, But at the same time, it was like, well, then we didn't get a paycheck and you achieved nothing either. So I do think that when we look at what the next Congress looks like, we need new leaders to be able to come in that recognize the moment that we really are in as a country and recognize that we can't be just relying on, well, this is the way we've always done it. We need a new thought process. We need new ways of leading and building coalitions. So many people talk about the need to work across the aisle, but then every incentive in Congress is not to work across the aisle. It's just simply to whip everybody into party line and go that way. I think we need to be elevating more leaders that have those demonstrated capacity to work with Republicans and Democrats to get stuff accomplished for the American people.
I agree. Sorry to cut you off, Jen. I agree with you. And having watched politics as long as I have, I know what happens when a party gets the beating the Republican Party is about to undergo in November, and how it falls apart and it fractures, and it's going to fracture in a big way. It already is. You're seeing a fracture of the MAGA, right? The people that no longer believe in MAGA and realize it was a grift, saying, oh, we're going to be over here and just be the America First pact, like the America First Party. And they are already moving economically to the left. I don't know if you saw Tucker Carlson's latest interview. I can't remember who he was talking to, but Tucker Carlson was pretty much saying, I believe the hype, the conservative capitalist hype. And now I realize that the United States is not a situation where a government is overseeing corporations. Corporations is overseeing the government.
Yep. I love this. I use this one a lot when talking to people. And I'll sit there and they'll say, how are you going to convince Republicans to get behind supporting myself in the general election? And I'll sit there and say, well, again, go back and meet them where they're at. And so they sit there and we'll make America great again. Okay, tell me when America was great. What are we going back to? And so many of them, they'll use this weaponized nostalgic version of the 1950s and 1960s and say, well, that's when everything was great. I was like, well, first of all, the 1950s and 1960s economy did not work for everybody. But if you want to believe that, what is it about that time that you look at this? Well, we were investing in science, and we were investing in schools, and we were building infrastructure. We were doing all these things. It's like, okay, do you know what the top tax rate was in 1960? And they'll say, no. I was like, it was 70%. Mm-hmm. And they're like, well, I was like, if we're going to invest in working class Americans, we do have to look at those sorts of things. We have to recognize the fact that we've got to be able to build in a mechanism to reinvest in working class Americans like we did but it has to be all Americans. And what we've seen in the economy that we look back on favorably, even though, like I said, even though we know historically it didn't work for everybody, but the aspects that we try to remember, the good parts, we look at that and say, well, that's where we were invested. We were focusing on good union jobs where a waitress could have a living wage and live a healthy life. And we've gone away from that. And I think that we do have to have that conversation. That, again, is not a Democrat or Republican issue. That's a lived experience issue of so many people in our community. And we have an opportunity to claw back those Reagan Democrats that left in the early 80s because they felt like they were getting left behind. And now, they're finding themselves in that same situation where economically they have not moved forward. And now they're looking for that vision. But they're tired of two parties that are so focused on corporate interests and not average Americans that they've lost faith in both.
Yes. So there is another question from the chat. Would you agree with impeaching certain members of the cabinet, such as RFK Jr. and Pete Hegseth?
Absolutely. Pete Hegseth is the least competent Secretary of Defense, I think, in the history of the Department of Defense. RFK is doing tremendous damage to our ability to deliver public health programming. He's eroding the trust that we have in our public health system. And it's a huge issue right now. Wherever you might stand on your health issues, right, it only works when you have access to good, trustworthy information. And we do have to make sure that, our government should be that reliable source of knowing that, hey, here's where this source data is and coming from, so that we can be able to do that. And I do think that, and what should give us all a little bit of optimism is that you look at the bipartisan support to push out people like Pam Bondi and Kristi Noem because of the fact that it was very obvious that they were grossly violating our constitutional principles. They were not doing the role that they had sworn to do. And you had Republicans and Democrats that got together and say, nope, this person does not belong in office. So yeah, absolutely.
All right. So you touched on this a little bit. In politics, you have to do a lot of compromising. You have to, if you plan to work with people across the aisle. I would like to know, and I think other voters would like to know, what are your lines in the sand? So, so things that you absolutely wouldn't compromise on. And are you following any particular legislative bills at the moment that are piquing your interest?
Lines in the sand, right? There's elements of, first of all, when we talk about immigration, right? We cannot have an immigration system that is being used for discrimination and retaliation and fear and not serving law and order. We can't have that. The basics, right? A woman's right to choose, right? And I think it's so ironic, the fact that Republicans consistently come up there and say, we want less government in our lives. And yet, why are you deciding you want to put judges and lawyers in the exam room with women to make those decisions for them? That's not less government. That's the most intrusive form of government. And so those areas. The emerging legislation on like the Clarity Act on crypto, this is a huge deal. If you look how the Trump family is using their own crypto coin to cipher billions of dollars from average Americans, it's become a scam. And so we need real legislation that looks at crypto, that recognizes the fact that blockchain technology is something that we need to be looking at because it can help better secure our financial system. But cryptocurrency, when it's not backed by anything, is really just a giant pyramid scheme. And people don't get that. And people are losing out on their life savings because of this. And so that's an area that I've looked at particularly with interest over the past couple of months. There's a whole bunch of things that we need to be reforming. Again, people often say, what's the first thing you're going to do when you get to Congress? Well, the first thing we have to do is we've got to rescind this big, beautiful bastard that has caused so much pain across our government. It's deeply unpopular. We got to get it out of there. We've got to bring back a lot of these programs that were gutted because they were serving Americans and Americans want them.
We just love having candidates like you who really understand what's going on. You're obviously very knowledgeable, very informed on the real issues that people are facing. So yeah, it's very enjoyable. And I can see I'm just like watching the chat because Jen's taking the lead. I usually am taking the lead. So I like this for once. So I'm able to get the chat's reaction to you and people love you. So data center. Okay. So yep. Are you doing data centers next?
It's not next, but it is on my list pretty soon after. So
all right.
I will be getting to it fairly soon. There was something that you mentioned in the Indivisible Town Hall. You mentioned something about a dark history that we have, and especially with regard to land. I would love if you could please elaborate on that dark history that you referred to, and why is that important for us to know as voters?
So in Colorado, this is kind of a hyper-local issue. So if you're not from Colorado, water rights is a huge deal to everything that we do in the West. So the Colorado River Compact is a coalition of all the states that take water out of the Colorado River. And if you are following weather out here, we had one of the worst snowpacks ever in recorded history. And so when you look at our two major reservoirs, Lake Mead and Lake Powell, both are down almost near what's called dead pool, where they're practically just not even there anymore. Water rights was something that was established, as the West was being won, and really what it stole water from was from our indigenous Native American neighbors. And so, despite the fact that they've been living here far before any one of us moved out west, their rights were pulled away from them, and those that continue to live on our Native American reservations aren't getting access to their water. And now we're even seeing it go even further, where you see corporations are starting to invest in these water rights as a way of commoditizing them, which is pushing up costs for each and every one of us. Because in our communities, development and water rights go hand in hand. You can't build if you don't have water rights. And if you have to pay extra for water rights, it means we're all going to have to pay extra for it. the comment was talking about our national lands, our national parks specifically. And so when we think about the fact of, and I'm a transplant here. I grew up in Salem, Massachusetts, where the witch trials happened. And I talk about this a lot of, like, when you talk about a dark spot in American history, the Salem witch trials obviously are top of the list of that, of the sort of discrimination and murder that occurred because of accusations of witchcraft. And we've got to be able to embrace and learn from that history. So when we think about slavery, when we think about pushing indigenous peoples off their lands, and now we have an administration, a regime that has decided to whitewash our history and say, well, these things, we don't want to talk about those things. And I'd sit there and say, listen, if we want to be a strong nation, we have to be able to embrace those dark parts of our history and tell that full story so that we can learn from it. And so that our kids don't repeat that. And our kids understand why our Black and Brown communities, our Native American communities are impoverished and why they struggle with, multi-generational poverty. And to understand the privilege that us as a cisgender single white dude, why what that looks like of my lived experience is so much different than someone else. And we have to be able to tell that story so that we can recognize, again, how we move forward and learn from it and not repeat it.
And
So
I'm sorry. I just had a follow up to that. So I love that you are talking about this and you talk about it so comfortably, because you can really tell when somebody when they're really not sure and they're uncomfortable talking about it, or, and it's okay. It's okay to be uncomfortable as long as you're good with being uncomfortable and just sitting in it, because sometimes we have to have the uncomfortable conversations, as we keep saying. So do you believe that we should be having that conversation now? Do you believe that, there's a certain time and place for it, or do you believe we should just be full-throatedly having those conversations every chance we get, and bringing up the fact that there were a portion of Trump supporters, that after everything else fell away, after the economic promises didn't pan out, after the no new wars didn't pan out, after all this stuff did not pan out, and they are still holding on. And when you ask them, they really can't give you an answer besides immigration. And you realize, so you're telling me that it was about the racism for you. It really is at this point, if especially for white people, specifically white men. So it was about, cis white men keeping power for you. That's what this was about then, is what you're telling me, if you're still hanging on. So do you think that it's this conversation that we need to just be real and transparent with the idea that, look, we know? Or do you think that we have to be careful when we're talking about this so as not to alienate people that aren't ready to have that uncomfortable conversation? So where do you stand on that?
I think the short answer to that question is we always have to be having that conversation. But to your point of those folks that might be uncomfortable when you go at it full bore, you got to recognize who you're talking to and how you engage in that conversation. But we've got to be able to have it. We've got to be able to push the limits of that. I love what you talked about with that phrase of, being comfortable, being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that is exactly how I live my life. And that's why I live out here in Colorado, because I love going out in the mountains when it's cold and being super uncomfortable. That's fun for me. And so I think we do have to be willing to push those conversations. And I think it has to be moving in that productive sense of saying, hey, we don't want to do this again. And, it's not that if we don't have those conversations, then we're just going to repeat the same mistakes. And so there is a way to have that conversation in a way that even those that are uncomfortable, we can bring them into the fold and give them that space to say, hey, this is not an accusatory conversation. This is a learning conversation that we want you to be part of too, because I don't believe that you want to be that person that you are. And
Right.
maybe just how do we get to that point? And you talk about, and I've got two boys. I'm raising two boys, and it's a challenge of how do you. They are surrounded by this faux masculinity of people that want to put on this persona of, oh, I'm a tough guy. And it's like, well, no, you're not. You are overcompensating for insecurity and weakness. And of course, young men experience that. But let's give them the space to say, hey, kindness is not weakness. And the strongest people I've ever met are also the kindest people. And that's the thing that we should be teaching all kids. That's the way that we should be approaching our interactions with every one of our friends and neighbors.
I agree. And I love that you talked about raising young men and, you know, especially in this environment where you have the red pill manoverse and, you know, manosphere and all that kind of stuff where, you know, more Gen Z young men believe that women belong in the household and shouldn't make more money than men and all, you know, all those antiquated ideas more than boomers. Like more than the boomer generation, like double the amount. Like that is so alarming. And I do think that, you know, they are deconstructing a little bit. I do believe that like the documentary, the Manoverse documentary kind of shone a light on the grift that is the red pill sphere, right? That what they are really doing is like, they're grifting them, they're scamming them, telling them that, you know, all these crazy things that is negative and harmful to them overall in order to get their money. So I do think that we need to have a conversation in this country while we're having the conversation about xenophobia and racism and you know, we also have to have the conversation about the fact that women for so long in this country helped prop up men, right? We helped men succeed. And men extracted our energy, our intelligence, our ingenuity, our problem-solving skills, our, you know, all the things. And now that they don't have it, they were so used to doing that. Like men are not, like they didn't evolve with a lot of the skills that women did, those survival skills that had us having to think on our feet so that we could survive the man that might come home and unalive us because, you know, he just felt like it and we were his property, right? So it's like, yeah, so I do love that you are already thinking ahead to your sons and thinking about the broader society and how we have to get past all this stuff.
You know, and I just, because I talk a lot about my sister. My sister was a teacher. And when she became pregnant with my nephew, the cost of childcare was going to be more than what she was being paid as a teacher. And wow. So, I mean, that was the decision as a couple they made that she stepped back from the workforce and it worked for them at the time. But when you think about earning potential, we forget sometimes that employer contributions to things like 401ks. You know, if a woman does choose to step away from the work to focus on childcare, you know, they're missing out on years of retirement savings because they're not being able to contribute. You know, they're not having an employer contribution. They're not able to put aside savings for themselves. And I think that if we are serious about recognizing and supporting working families, we've got to look at those sorts of solutions as well as saying, you know, we need to make sure that childcare is affordable for everybody. And if that's not your path, right, making sure that everyone is able to still have savings so that you're not reliant on a spouse. You're not financially tied to someone in that relationship. You're stuck in this relationship, potentially an abusive relationship, because financially you can't afford. And I've done a lot of work in homelessness, and people always sit there and say, oh, well, you know, they're just drug addicts, they're this, they're that. I was like, no, that's like 10% of the homeless population. Go into one of these shelters and what you'll find is a good portion of our unhoused neighbors are women and children that are fleeing domestic violence. Mm-hmm. And so we've got to be able to address those sorts of issues. And if I can bring it back just 1 second with one more thing, right? Because we talk about, you know, one area that I've talked a lot about is about mental health. And, you know, as an Army veteran, I did 2 tours in Afghanistan. I lost more of my former soldiers to suicide than I did actual combat. And so having those honest conversations of saying, we've got to be open and transparent about what mental health looks like and about how seeking help and viewing mental health the same way we would view, you know, taking a rest day, taking a personal day off of work to reset and make sure that you're actually able to be your optimal self. And again, this isn't about, you know, this isn't a problem. This is, you know, veterans and teens and our LGBTQ plus youth. You know, all of these folks are struggling with it. We've got to be willing to have those conversations of saying, hey, asking for help is the stronger thing to do. Don't internalize it. get out there, ask for help, and be your optimal self.
That's really difficult to do. I'm just going to comment real quick because, like I said, I do have more questions, and I'm going to try to divert to the data centers just because I've seen a lot of people asking it. But yeah, that's really tough in a society nowadays where everything is very egocentric for each person, very hyper individualized, where I can look at a person, I'm not saying me personally, but like just the standard person can look at another person who's in need and say, well, I didn't need that when I was in this situation. I just pulled myself up by my bootstraps. And so then society as a whole has been very dismissive of actual need and acknowledgement that times have changed. You know, we grew up in different circumstances. Our kids, your kids, my kids, they are growing up in a different time, and their needs are different. So the lack of acknowledgement of that, acceptance of that, and the acknowledgement
that's
that
ego too, right, Jen? Isn't that ego, right? Yeah. That, I mean, for boomers to accept that it's a lot harder out there for our young people to get what they got. Is like they would have to acknowledge that, oh, I had it easier than you. Therefore, I have to admit that I didn't work as hard as you're having to work, and I got twice as much as you for half the work. Like that's, you know, I think that piece, right? The indoctrination, like you said, of the toxic individualism and the huge egos that we all have as Americans, the best country in the world, and we're all very, very special people. It like feeds into that.
Yeah, for sure. So let me jump real quick to the data centers, because like I said, I saw that there are a lot of questions about it. And just to give people a little bit of a background on Joe's area in Colorado. So Colorado Springs, El Paso County, it's a pretty big tourist draw. In fact, there's like about $3 billion a year, I think, in tourist income that feeds the local economy. A lot of that is environmental appeal, right? It's the environment, right? So this brings me to the data centers. How do you feel about the data centers that are being built? What parameters or regulations do you feel are important to protect the health and quality of life for your constituents, as well as the health of the environment that Colorado is known for?
First of all, VJ, thank you for being concerned that I'm standing, but I am a pacer, so I get uncomfortable when I'm sitting down. So I do prefer to stand when I'm working. That's just but I appreciate you thinking about that. So on data centers, you talk about our environment here in Colorado being, a lot of that is a tourist industry component to it. And we have, so locally, the big issue that we have here is there is a data center that is essentially being put into a local neighborhood. And the concern there is, the challenge is that a lot of that decision was being made by county and city officials that brought in there. And there's some things that were advantageous to it. The logic why they wanted this here was because the utilities infrastructure was already in place to be able to support it. What they've said is that the noise was actually going to be less than the previous industrial facility that was in there in the first place. And on the water usage side, it is a closed loop system, and so it isn't going to be consuming as much water as has been talked about. Now, how truthful those statements are, I don't know, and I think there's a lot of reasons to question that. So when we talk local, hyper-local, that's where that connection is. So at the federal level, what do we need to be doing? Clear environmental standards. And what I've spent a lot of time looking at is there is a group, it's a mixture of labor and environmental groups called the Blue-Green Alliance that are really trying to understand how do you bring together these things that create strong union-focused jobs to build what we need while having minimal environmental impact. Water is so often the big component of that, and that's why these closed-loop systems are really key. But what isn't talked a lot about is the heat that is generated from these things as well. So I think in one study I read that these things can increase the temperature of around like 5 degrees within about a 2 to 3 mile radius. So putting it inside of a neighborhood, obviously we can see that that's not a great idea. And I know somebody put a comment in there about the impacts on wildlife too. And on the noise side, there is of course what the audible version of what we as humans can hear, but there's also a substantial amount of subsonic vibrations that also get into there. So we don't hear this sound, but it does impact our bodies and impacts our animal bodies. And so the best way to describe it is if you're familiar with what happened in Havana with the embassy there, the Havana syndrome. Like that is a subsonic weapon that was presumably being used against U.S. Diplomatic officials there, and that's kind of what one of these data centers would be looking at. So we've got to make sure that in terms of what that environmental impact, it does consider the health of humans as well as the animal population. Here in Colorado Springs, we also have a pretty robust space industry, and so looking at I don't like the Chinese have been experimenting with undersea data centers. Well, then we're just warming up the ocean even more, and that seems like that's not going to help us with anything. So we have the idea of potentially looking at space-based data centers as another means, but then there's an environmental impact to that component as well.
Yeah. So when you're having big data centers falling out of the sky and pieces of it. So right. I had not heard about this, but Joe or Jen, you guys may have heard of it. Senior in the chat says Texas cattle farmers near data centers are reporting no calves being born, just stillbirths.
I heard that. Yeah.
Oh my, that is just, I mean, oh my, and DJ says it also affects the water supply. It does.
The thing that I would like to say, and I did see another comment from VJ, I think it was from Babs who said, does it mean he's for them? And I'm going to just offer my point of view, and then Joe, I'd love for you to chime in. There are some things that I feel like aren't going to be, we can't oppose all of them. We do need some of these things. Data centers, by the way, you guys, have existed for a really long time. But the thing that we're looking at now is these AI
massive ones
that are creating these bigger impacts on the environment. People who live in the area, like Joe said, wherever you put it, it's going to impact the environment and wildlife, things like that. So my feeling is we can find ways, if we put our minds to it, if we slow the F down, and if we put enough regulation on it, to do it the right way. There can be best practices implemented. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing. And today, we do find ourselves a lot of time in an all or nothing mindset. And when you think about politics and you think about people going to DC, this is a lot about compromise, right? A lot of bills are, I'll give you this if you give me that. And that's why I asked Joe earlier, what are your lines in the sand? Because some things maybe you should never compromise on, right? When it comes to human rights, for example. But with data centers, it does have a direct correlation to progress in certain areas. But in my opinion, and I think a lot of people would feel this way, a lot of voters would feel this way, is that we have put profit and this race to the top over, human quality of life and our environment and animals and all the things that affect our ecosystem. And so there is, I think, our failure in many, many ways. So there can be best practices. So I want to tell everybody in the chat, I'm not fully 100% against, like, don't ever build them, but slow down, build them the right way, ensure that we have protections for all the things that we've been mentioning. So that's kind of where I'm going with this, Joe, do you have any specific ideas with regard to regulation? And I guess you've touched on some of them already, so that we can move forward, maybe include something about a timeline. So what have you been thinking about in this regard? Because if you do get into office, clearly this will need to be something that you and your colleagues address sooner than later, hopefully.
Yeah, and so like I said, we talk about the Blue-Green Alliance as being that organization that helps us find that. If we're doing this, we've got to be able to do it in a way that does not have an impact on our climate and our health. One of the more novel things that I've seen emerge, which I think is kind of interesting, is, and this actually has a privacy component to it as well, which is more localized, like in-home data centers. So you would have a small data center in your own home that would process your data. And so it addresses the privacy component, because you said it as well. For too long, we've been trading convenience for privacy, and we've surrendered so much of that. So our data is out there. Our data is accessible to others. We don't own it anymore. It's being sold to everybody. We cannot allow the tech industry to simply write their own rules, because that's what has got us into this problem. Whether it be data centers, whether it be over-monopolization of organizations like Amazon, hyper corporate profits at the expense of workers. And there's plenty of conversations to be had about how Amazon. Yeah. What's that?
Private equity is, it's just outrageous that they've been able to like pretty much write their own rules and undo all the regulations and kind of work outside the banking sector and the banking, like outside any of the banking regulations that are still in place so that they could pretty much do whatever they want.
Right. And so that's where, like you said, that decision-making really needs to be on focus on protecting each and every one of us. Babs All the Way has a comment here. It's like, should we have a right to our own images? And of course we should, right? This is our likeness. This is our, and we see this when we talk about AI. And I think there's the data center component, like the physical build, there's the privacy component and AI and what that looks like. And it's alarming to me to see the amount of intimidation, of bullying that exists by utilizing AI, especially with young adults who are seeing their, you have tools online that people can take those photos and create, very disturbing images that are being used to harm young people. And there's been no means to be able to do that. And so Europe has kind of found a good balance, I think, of trying to figure out that right to privacy without infringing on the First Amendment. And I do think that we need to really fundamentally relook who is owning the data that we generate and how are we able to protect our privacy? We should have the right to be forgotten and not have that information out there, because in so many different ways it impacts us. I mean, like, I'm 44 years old. Like my teen years are not captured online. They are captured in an old photo album that is sitting in a closet somewhere, hopefully never to be found. But that doesn't exist for our teenagers today, right? Everything that they're doing is documented. On the campaign, on the campaign, we've taken a lot of steps that not to photograph my kids, make sure the kids are not part of that, to protect their privacy. And so I think that there's a whole. We have not fundamentally addressed the law around communications in any form since like the 1980s, and we have allowed the tech industry to essentially have free reign to create a system where we are the product, we are not the customer, right? And how often do you get to talk to Facebook customer service? You don't, because you're not the customer. You're the product. They're selling you as a service to someone else, and we've got to be able to bring that back into the fold, because we've traded too much of that privacy for that convenience.
You know what? I kind of love that you put it that way, because it grosses me out. And I actually think that's the visceral reaction that more people need to hear and have in order to help vote the right way. Whether it's your constituents to support you so that you can vote the right way on our behalf. But I don't think enough people are understanding how we are being used. And that's a gross feeling. And I think we should be grossed out by it, and so we can stop it.
Yeah. What do you think about the Sanders bill? Are you familiar with that? Bernie Sanders just introduced a bill that would pretty much force AI companies to give us 50% of the stock, like the value of the stock price, like pretty much 50% of their stock, right? Because AI was built on our collective intellectual property, yep. Right? That all of us owned it, right? All the books that were written by our ancestors and the things we wrote, the college papers I wrote, or whatever, anything that was out there was used to teach AI, and AI uses it now to create new products, artists, music, all this stuff. And what he said is we deserve to be compensated for that. And he is talking about creating a sovereign wealth fund for AI companies where we would benefit, where the American people would get 50%, like, a 50% investment in like earnings from it.
That's a really interesting idea. When you look at how you could use a sovereign wealth fund for a number of different policy areas to come back and support us, right? And like states like Alaska have used it for years from proceeds from oil and gas. Right, and that was the logic was, hey, if you're using our natural resources, then we should be profiting from it. So I'll have to look more into that one, but I think it's spot on exactly what we should be looking for. It's also requires us to relook laws around monopolies and these major corporations that are benefiting from it. We need, who's not exploiting you, right? The small business owner that lives downtown, that's the person that's not going to exploit you because they're your neighbor. And so we've got to be able to find those ways where we can be investing in small business, we can be diversifying and bringing more people into the picture, that we're not just allowing these major corporations, because you also don't see wealth disparity in small businesses, right? Major corporations where you see this 200 times, CEOs making 200 to 300 times the amount of their average worker. You go downtown, you see a small business owner, that small business owner is the last one to be paid. And they're working right alongside every one of their employees.
Right.
They're taking care of their employees. And so I think that, and one of the programs that I've managed was under the Small Business Administration, of recognizing the innovation that exists in small business and how that they can really push us forward in a responsible way that's accountable for us.
Yeah, I love that. Love it. I love it all. I love everything you're saying. Go ahead, Jen.
I'm going to jump into kind of a heavier question here, because I did not hear this specifically called out at the Indivisible Town Hall, which is about Israel and Congress's role in the ongoing support to Israel without conditions being attached to those resources. I would love to hear your thoughts about how that is going on with Gaza, specifically, because that's kind of how this all started, and now with Iran and Lebanon.
Yeah. I mean, we should never be utilizing U.S. foreign assistance in a way that is inconsistent with our values as a country. And what we're seeing happen in Israel and in Gaza and in Iran is exactly that. This is inconsistent with our values. It's inconsistent with what we're trying to achieve. I look at that and I'd say, what Benjamin Netanyahu has been doing in Israel is he is corrupt. He has been convicted, he's been accused of war crimes. This is not someone that we should be providing weapons to. And we've got to recognize the strength of our country, of the fact that the way that we administer influence with other countries is to say, you're going to do it the way that we want you to do it, or we're not going to help you. And when we stop doing that for an ally like Israel, right, then they're just sitting there and say, well, they think Benjamin Netanyahu thinks he's in charge. And he is. He's been manipulating Donald Trump because Donald Trump he doesn't get what's going on. And so in Congress, yes, we have an absolute responsibility to be able to make sure that American financial aid, our military assistance, is being executed and delivered in a way that is consistent with our values. I do also spend a lot of time talking about the fact that, right, when you look at how our European allies are viewing us right now, and they're seeing us act in a way that is inconsistent with the values that we pledged to contribute with NATO. And so we have a big responsibility that we have to turn that around with our NATO allies once Donald Trump is out of office. And I would sit there and say, once Israel puts a leader in that wants to be actually pushed towards a reasonable peace in the Middle East and actually achieve a sustainable two-state solution, then yeah, we can work towards that. That's what we want. That's what we've always wanted. But we need leaders that are willing to work with us in order to achieve those common goals. And we don't have that in Benjamin Netanyahu. We shouldn't be supporting him because of it.
So it's interesting that you use the word or the phrase consistent with our values. And it seems to me that the values have shifted dramatically with the people that are inside of our, in air quotes, leadership right now, and even in Congress, and even within the Democratic Party. There does seem to be a divide. If you were put into office, how would you go about getting an essence of solidarity, at least within the party, if not within the entire Congress, so that we can get what we believe to be our American values back? That is humanity and, contributing to the betterment of humanity worldwide, versus what we're seeing right now, which is absolute atrocities. We use the word G-side in these TikTok streets here. I don't know how you feel about it, but anyway, I'll let you go ahead and respond to that.
Yeah. So, building consensus around how do we create a foreign assistance infrastructure that supports our values, and how do we define those values and what they look like internationally? This is an area where I think that we have spent far too long, and this is a veteran saying this, by the way, we've spent far too long putting too much investment into the defense side of things as opposed to recognizing the soft power component that has been far more effective over the course of our history. And so how do we strengthen, of course, USAID was cut. How do we strengthen programs like that or create a new form of USAID that's able to do that? And I think there are those areas to build coalitions around that, because again, it focuses on how do we deliver aid? How do we deliver human assistance? How do we make sure that we're supporting people and showing our values that way and not just giving arms out to everybody, because that's not helping anything. And more, when you look at both Republicans and Democrats, you're seeing this pushback on the military-industrial complex and seeing the fact that it is focused purely on profits and not actually reasonable American foreign policy. And so we've got to be able to strengthen our diplomatic corps and identify those areas that we're able to work more effectively with both the international bodies like the UN and NATO and all the rest, while also making sure that we're supporting our other alliances and having the things, and in many cases, by going in the wrong direction here, we have ceded leadership over to China and Russia and so many others that have been able to now gain influence in other communities that are hurting us back here in the United States. And so I think that's how you build that coalition. I think the discussion around American values is, I think that we're there and we just forget sometimes that we actually have to use that in our decision making.
Okay, so I love what you're saying and it sounds like amazing. If I was listening to a TED Talk, I would be standing up in my chair. But I do think that we hear this a lot from candidates, right? Here's what we need to do. Here's what the ideal situation. It all sounds great. Do you have ideas of how to actually get there? What does that actually look like within Congress? How do you work toward those angles to convince people, because we are so divided, and this kind of lends into one of my other questions, was how do you start bridging the divide so that we can start moving in the direction that you're talking about? What does that actually look like?
So bridging the divide is all about, you look at the way that the HR1, the big beautiful bastard, was passed, and essentially it was Republicans put everything they wanted to do in one bill and just forced everyone to do it. That's not how you build. And there's plenty of Republicans that said, I don't like this part, I don't like that part, but I feel like I have to vote for this. So finding those narrow areas of agreement in partnership to be able to build on it and say, hey, listen, when we talk about the National Defense Authorization Act, making sure that we're putting those provisions in it to say, no, we are not going to support this. We are going to support that. If this is done, this is the manner in which it's going to be done. And finding those partners that exist on both sides of the aisle to be able to find those narrow compromises. I think in some areas, right, where I've found success over the years in working with policymakers is not trying to achieve some huge, big goal all at once, but finding that area where we can bring that coalition together, identifying the needs of what everyone's trying to do, find those narrow areas of agreement and build a coalition around it. And then you look at the different caucuses and the way that the Republican MAGA establishment is starting to fracture, the way the Democrats are fracturing. There's a lot of space for people to now be working with one another, but they've got to be willing to, you need leadership in Congress too, that's willing to work across the aisle and work to achieve something as opposed to just pushing a party agenda.
So one of the biggest obstacles that we see to people joining a coalition or joining a movement is money. And you did mention this earlier about Citizens United and getting money out of politics. I think, probably 90% of America agrees we need money out of politics or something close to that. But being that that's not an overnight thing, right? That's something we have to work toward. Are you willing to call out even your fellow Democrats in Congress if you see that money is influencing their decisions?
I did, and I have. We've talked about the fact that when the D-Trip came down, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Commission came down and endorsed my opponent and said, hey, the money's playing a role in this. This is major donors that aren't tied to our district that are funding a campaign that is not built around our community and calling it out for what it is. And that's exactly what we're talking about and it's funny. So let me reverse that question of when I talk to Republicans. And one of the barriers, they say, well, I don't want to vote for you because if you come in, you're just going to do what the Democratic Party wants you to do. And I don't want that to happen either. I say, that's fair. Well, what's interesting about those dynamics, though, is the only way you fall into it. And they say, in a competitive district like CD5, right, winning here means I'm going to be one of those people that delivers the Democratic majority back to the House. Mm-hmm. And so where when someone wants to push back and say, well, you need to support this, and say, well, if I support this, I lose my seat. If I lose my seat, you lose your majority. So you've got to be able to work with me. And it was funny because I also told this guy, I said, listen, like, go back to talk to literally every boss I've ever worked for, and they will tell you that I'm a royal pain in the ass because I'm not someone that will just sit there and toe the party line and say, no, we're going to do the right thing. We're going to do, and I'm going to push you and make sure that I am that, you know, that squeaky wheel that will not shut up if we're not doing this the right way.
Okay, I like that. I actually think it's a good segue into Helena's comment in the chat. Do you support expanding the Supreme Court? And she says specifically to 13 districts. And
yep. So I've seen that proposal, and I think I kind of alluded to this at the beginning where we're talking about structural reform across these institutions, right? What we don't want to create is almost like an arms race around just the redistricting and, you know, adding justices, taking away justices, right? That isn't productive policy. Going to the 13 does make sense because it is aligned with the different circuit courts. And from a productivity standpoint, there is a logic to that I think we could get behind. Before we get to that point, though, what we absolutely must do is ethics reform in the Supreme Court. And that's probably the short-term one. If we've got to be able to go and have a enforceable, measurable, and transparent ethics bill that holds the Supreme Court accountable, because right. It doesn't exist. The Supreme Court said, well, we'll do it ourselves. We'll self-police. Well, that doesn't work, and that's not what Congress is. Congress is check. Congress can impeach Supreme Court justices too when they are in violation of their oath. And so we have to remember that Congress does have that oversight authority over the courts.
They sure
to be able to
do.
go back and say, hey, if you are not operating consistent with the law, and you are not living up to your oath. So yes, I've seen some of these proposals. I'm interested in it, but the short-term fix is we've got to get ethics reform in the Supreme Court, and we've got to have Congress willing to hold justices accountable when they are clearly making decisions that are not consistent with the law, right? And I cannot fathom the fact that when we look at these right now, the conservative justices they're always talking about, we're textualists. Well, no, you're not. The
No,
text
you're
says
not.
that you're not supposed to do that.
Yes.
You don't let text us when you want it to be.
Unless the text is the Powell memo from 1971, then yeah, I would agree with you. Then you are a textualist, right? And that you're going by the text. But a friend of ours, a creator that is usually in here, but he went to bed early tonight, Terry, he usually asks, would you be willing to look at the proposal of expanding the court to 13 justices, one for each district or circuit court?
Yeah. I would be interested in looking at that.
Yeah.
There's a lot to it. But I think that's if anything, that is the way to make reform without having to go with this constant back.
Yeah,
and forth.
it's not arbitrary. There's
Right.
there is a set amount and it's reasonable, right? If you should have one justice from each district, right? From each circuit to represent that circuit in making the decisions, right? I feel like it's very much more in line with our republic, our democracy, and the way that we do things. And I mean, it's not like it would be the first time. We used to have 5 justices, and then it got expanded to 9. So it's not like a thing that's never been done before. It wouldn't be new, right? And you're right. Congress can pretty much remake the entire federal court system if it wanted to. That's how much power it has.
And like I said, and using that power responsibly to make sure that the courts, that the executive branch is doing its job and living up to like I said, the responsibilities that the Constitution clearly lays out.
100%.
So, yeah, go ahead.
No, I had another question from the chat that was before this one. Do you think that other countries will ever trust the U.S. again?
I do. At least I hope they do. I think that at the end of the day, right, was it, I don't know if Churchill actually ever said this, but right, Americans always do the right thing after trying everything else. So I don't think we've exhausted all of it, but we're pretty darn close to having executed all the bad choices. How do we go back to the international community and reassure those old alliances that we have in fact did? And I think it is going to require a lot of work. And again, it goes back to the conversation around ethics reform and showing the fact that, hey, why was this administration able to cause so much harm to these alliances? And that comes back to, right, we've got to strengthen the guardrails on the executive branch. That is power that is, it's not just this
administration. It cannot be the honor system. We can no longer go on the honor system. And this is why people were so pissed off at Democrats, because anybody that remembers the 2018 midterm campaign and the 2020 campaign, that was one of the biggest things that they ran on, was the fact that we can't have a president that's going on the honor system anymore. We have to put up the guardrails, the checks and balances, and then didn't do anything once they got back in there, right? It was infuriating.
Yeah, sounds good on paper.
And that's right. And other countries are looking for us to have that level of leadership to come back and say, how are you going to prevent this from happening again? Because it's not just something that this administration has abused, but many other administrations have done the same thing. Right? Go back to the Bush administration, the way that we engaged NATO and sucked them into this foreign war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, I was part of that. I think allies go back and say, well, wait a second, you can't say we didn't contribute to collective defense. Like, we were there alongside you. I worked for a British commander for a short period of time because we're out there doing it.
Right.
And I think it is on us. And so it's how do we get back to that point? You've got to get competent people that understand how these alliances actually operate, right? We put a television host in charge of the Secretary of Defense, which is a real far drop from what we had in Lloyd Austin. Someone that was tremendous. I've worked for him personally, and he's just someone that was a tremendous leader that understood how to leverage alliances and be able to make that work. And so that's, it's not just about the people that we elect, but it's the people that those people that we elect are going to surround themselves with, and how those people are going to be able to influence policy. And again, it goes back to strengthening our diplomatic corps, as well as making sure that we're going to those career diplomats that have been and spent time in these countries, that are experts in all aspects of that history and culture, and be able to translate that both in how our values as Americans align with what they're doing, and how we're going to be able to support them collectively.
All right. I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but I would love to know, as a congressperson, where do the mega detention centers, and there's been a couple of articles on these mega detention centers that are being built, supposedly will be operable by the end of this year. So those mega detention centers and the ICE detention centers, where do those fall in your list of priorities?
In terms of making sure they aren't built?
However you would like to respond. I'm going to leave that up to you, actually. I'm very curious as to what you think needs to be done, and then also where they fall in your priorities.
We shouldn't be imprisoning innocent people, period. Right? Putting people into camps is never the things that good guys do. And so here in Colorado, of course, there was proposed to have, I think, one or two of them. And no, I mean, ICE in its current form is violating its constitutional mandate. It is not being used as law enforcement. It has to be abolished because of the fact that what it is doing is infringing on the rights of Americans. And when you understand what the immigration system is supposed to look like, they're not detaining criminals. They're detaining people that are going through the process in the legal way. 86% of those that have been detained have zero criminal record, while the occupants of the Oval Office have a 100% record of criminal activity, right? And so when you look at that, we cannot allow for that funding to occur for DHS when they're doing things that, this is an administration that called due process inconvenient. And that should terrify each and every one of us, because when due process doesn't exist, then none of our rights matter. It's just a matter of, did I upset someone enough that now suddenly maybe my immigration status is questionable because my great-great-great-grandfather, when he came, maybe they didn't have paperwork. I don't know. And that's that, strengthening those sorts of protections. I would also say that in the event that we're not able to do that, as a member of Congress, having the full legal right to inspect those facilities without any notice, you better believe that I'm going to be there in those facilities making sure that people are allowed to have dignity, that if when someone is disappeared, that we're going to find them so their family members can know about it. And I think that when you talk about this, in terms of the fear factor component, I was talking to a family the other day, and they're a family of color, and their kids were afraid to leave school midday because they were afraid they were going to get detained on their way to lunch. How many people have not sought out the police because they were the victim of a crime, but they feared going to the police more than they did their attacker? Right? That's not justice. That's not doing anything to make our communities safer. It's making our communities far more dangerous. And what gives me a little bit of hope is, again, you see police officers, career police officers that are standing up and saying ICE is more of a danger to our community than anything else. They're making it harder for us to serve and protect the people in our own communities. And I think that you also have to consider that, you know, as a whole, our immigration system has to be compassionate. And I reflect so often on the fact of, you know, what is going through someone's life, what is going through their mind, when the best possible solution to them is, let me pack as much stuff in a backpack as I can with my children and leave in the middle of the night and walk 1,000 miles to get here, right? That's not someone that's trying to harm us. That's someone that's fleeing harm. And what we're seeing by this administration, how they use ICE, is not about law and order. It is not about immigration. It is about terror.
Do you see how this fits into the context of Project 2025 and the overall goal of a authoritarian government?
It was spelled out in it. I mean, I got to say, give them one for transparency. They told us exactly what they were going to do and exactly why they were going to do it. Now we're seeing it firsthand. And I feel like you see some Republicans are finally finding the courage to stand up and say, no, this isn't right. We shouldn't be doing this. We need more of that.
So if you are able to enforce the idea of inspecting a facility without notice, and you find inhumane conditions that are occurring, what do you believe should be done to that facility?
You know, well, and someone talked about many of these being the for-profit facilities, the for-profit prisons, right? Prisons shouldn't be a for-profit entity, period. So let's put that one aside and just say, hey, let's all agree, prisons shouldn't be for-profit. And that's not how they should be operating. We should be providing funding for it. It shouldn't be there. You got to hold people accountable. And again, if the leadership of that prison, whether they are a government employee, whether they are a private company, and they are providing conditions that are inhumane, they need to be held legally accountable for their actions and inactions, period.
Yeah, we're in a sticky situation here. So another group that is very vulnerable is our disability community. Yeah. And they've been experiencing a reduction in funding. We've had this brain drain that certainly affects the disability community, especially with regard to science, research, education, and many people in the disability community may already be suffering delays in progress and their ability to reach their potential. It will only worsen if their services are not reinstated and strengthened quickly. Where do those issues fall in your list of priorities?
So growing up, my mother had multiple sclerosis. And so from the time I was in about third grade until I was in my 30s, I've watched my mother's disease progress, where she went from a highly qualified nurse that was out there working each and every day, working to provide a life for my sister and I, and my dad worked too. And obviously as that disease progressed, moving from a cane to a walker, ultimately to a wheelchair, and seeing all of that along the way. And what really stuck with me as a kid too is when my mother became permanently in a wheelchair, how people responded to her. And they saw her not as a person, they saw the chair first and then her. And that has always stuck with me. One of my first jobs after leaving the military was with Easter Seals, which is a national organization that has focused its entirety, over 100 years of its existence, on supporting individuals with disabilities. So much of the work that I've done in the nonprofit space has been making sure that we create fair workplace accommodations, making sure that we have those different resources. When we talk about children with disabilities and making sure that our schools are accessible to them and that they're able to have a high quality education, that the resources are there to make sure they're supporting their IEPs. And here again in El Paso County, with 5 major military installations, we don't know why this is, but military children do struggle more with learning disabilities than others. And we need to figure out why, but we've also got to make sure that our schools are equipped and funded to be able to do that, because regardless of what zip code you're in, every child should have access to a high quality education. Disability rights are human rights, and we've got to be able to support that. And again, viewing people not because of their disability, but viewing them for the value that they're able to create, and viewing them for the value that they're bringing to our community. And going back to people like my mother, right? See her for who she was first, and then recognize the fact that the chair was just part of how she got from place to place.
I love that you have a personal connection to that, because I think that although some of your examples, are singular, it's not necessarily data driven, but I think it's still very impactful. So I love that you're able to bring that to the table. Yeah. My next question was about the PSYOPs that have been conducted in our country and used against the American population with regard to division. What do you think about the permission structure for hate and discrimination that has been established by this regime? How does Congress, in particular, work to help mend that divide and get back on the same page with regard to what is acceptable in society?
Well, I think so much of that conversation comes back to, again, getting greater transparency and money out of the way that we communicate, right? So social media has become such a cesspool of allowing people to hide behind screens and share this sorts of hateful comments and theories that often are things that have been promoted by bots, right? When Twitter opened up, right, like half the MAGA movement was Russian troll bots. And so we've got to be able to have that level of transparency when we're seeing information that we know where it's actually coming from, and the fact that a lot of this is being amplified by bots and by paid media and the way that the algorithms are structured in the first place to promote that sort of thing. And so social media has been allowed, social media companies and tech companies have been allowed to write these rules for so long and hide behind this idea of, well, the First Amendment says you can't do anything about it. Well, of course it does. That's why we can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? There are rules when it comes to how speech harms others that we've got to be able to look at that, refine what that means in a social media environment, and return those community norms back to what they are. And I think that legislation goes back to greater protections. So when you look at enforcing of community standards, greater transparency around who is posting and why they are posting, and making sure that we're focused on the interests of us as individuals rather than corporate profits, that really they're profiting off the rage more than anything else.
So do you think this falls back to, or harkens back to Citizens United, where, when we redefine what a corporation is, how it's able to use their freedom of speech as the same as a person, this kind of thing, because this is a difficult balance, right, between what is harmful, which can be a subjective, opinion, versus, the freedom of speech argument, which is, I can say what I want to say.
But you also can't say what you're going to say without also having to accept the consequences of that speech too. And I think that that's the balance that we often forget about. Of you have all these people say, well, I can do whatever I want to do. Well, it's not true. When you harm someone else, we do have rules around what it means when speech harms someone else. And I go back into, I think this is especially prevalent if we want to harken back to the AI part of this conversation around how do we manipulate images? How do deepfakes play into this? Of being able to potentially assault someone's character, not by saying something, but by manipulating their own words and making them say something that they didn't say in the first place. So there's so many different components to how do you rein in the social media space where it's been allowed to really take off. And then in our schools, making sure that we're talking about things honestly of what are those societal norms, what are the ways that we're supposed to be, what does civil conversation look like, and the fact that no, you you can't just say whatever you want because there's consequences to your speech as well.
Yeah, no, I'm welcome the day when we bring the consequences back. All right, I've got like just 2 more questions here, Joe. I've talked to several young people about why they haven't participated in the resistance, especially more publicly. Several of them have said that they would participate more if they felt it would make a difference. Mm-hmm. What do you say to voters who feel that once an elected official is in office, there's nothing they can do to make a difference? Mm-hmm. And yeah, so let's leave it at that.
We do, I don't even know how many events that we do a week. And so often the average age in any room where we're hosting a quote unquote political event is about 10 years older than I am. And so why don't young people show? Well, first of all, we don't make them feel welcome. And you've also got to think of what a young person is going through. Here in El Paso County, one thing that was really alarming to me is prior to the assembly, the county assembly, which is kind of the way that you have assembly, which kind of weeds out some of the candidates, and then you go on to the primary. So we had 5 candidates running at this point. The local college student group invited all 5 candidates to show up and do a forum on campus with the students. 3 of the 5 of us showed up. And of the 2 of us that are still in the race, I was the only one. And so how do we expect to have those conversations? How do we expect to engage young people if we're not willing to go and meet them in their spaces? And part of the problem is that we incentivize talking to rich donors and not voters, right? I know I'm not going to get $1,000 out of a college. I'm lucky to get $2 out of a college student. In fact, most of the time it costs me money because I got to give them free donuts and pizza. And I'm good with that if they're going to show up and do it. But on the other end of that spectrum, you have things that, well, I need money to fuel my campaign, so I'm going to spend all my time surrounding myself with rich donors that can bankroll my campaign, and I don't need to pay attention to anyone else because the young people, they'll show up and vote when it's time. We've also got to give them an opportunity to lead and give them opportunities in the political space where they can actually have a life and they're getting paid fairly to be out there and doing part of this work. We have an internship program as part of the campaign where it's not just hey, intern, do this job. It's giving them an actual leadership role, teaching them what it's like to be on a campaign, teaching them what it's like to do a field operation, and then putting them out there and say, hey, guess what? You go back to your college campus now, and you are going to be the one that organizes this event for the campaign without our support because we want to see you do it. We want to see what you're able to show us your creativity around it. So in a practical sense, that's as what we as a campaign have done to be able to do that. But we've also got to talk about their issues, right? Every issue when we talk about affordability, young people are experiencing it just as we are, but they've got so much more uncertainty associated with it because it's the rest of their lives. And we're seeing some young people that have been told time and time again, well, if you just do well in high school and then you get to college and you'll be fine. Well, that's not their lived experience. And so how do we make sure that we're taking on issues like student debt, student loans?
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you real quick. Are you engaging anybody like, community, not like advocates or community liaisons for you? So for example, if you're going to the college campuses, are you engaging like a leadership person on the college campus that can then sort of advocate for you or be a liaison for your team so that they can spread your message from somebody who the rest of the college people can relate to easier?
So in many of those cases, like if we're talking to like young Dems or student Dems or a student Democratic association, mm-hmm. right? Just like in party politics, like they shouldn't be an agent for any particular campaign, but we do look to those organizations as a mechanism to engage with the student population, to make that direct invite to say, hey, can you help us spread word about this event that we're doing on your campus? Or are there events that we should be part of? So yeah, I think in some cases we are using that, but not necessarily as a spokesperson for the campaign, but as that kind of, again, that trusted point of entry to where we're able to engage with students and young people where they're at.
Okay, and then there was another question. I have noticed, I come from the Bay Area in California, and it's highly diverse here. I noticed when I go to Colorado Springs area, there's a lot of palm color. Okay. But as you mentioned before, there are people of color there, and you said the Hispanic community, but how are you engaging with the communities where there's people of color and they may feel a little bit like, I don't belong in this conversation. So are you reaching out to them?
Yeah, so we have a number of different community groups that that we've been involved with, that I've been involved with for years. And I think part of the challenge is that people sense inauthenticity. And so when someone shows up into the community having never been there before and suddenly says, hey, I would like your vote, and that's the first time you've met this person, right? That's not how you establish trust. And so when I look at like the work that we've been doing through the local Rotary Club, where I'm a member there, and engaging in some of our low-income communities and helping out with their schools. And so being there and having those conversations there, engaging with some of our community groups that are focused on violence prevention and crime prevention through mentoring youth in these communities as well, and going out and showing up to those events, not to ask for a vote, but to be part of that solution for that community in particular. And if you were watching the Indivisible debate, we kind of spoke about this a little bit around, right, what does it mean to be investing in these communities and having to strengthen things like looking at the fact that this administration has cut funding to the small business, SBA's Minority Business Office that should be supporting those business owners in those communities to help really create thriving areas across all parts of our community. And so that's the sort of work that has put me into these spaces to have those conversations. To now, as a candidate, it's going back, and this is not the first time that they have met and engaged with me. Now it's like, oh, we've seen this person in our community before. This is someone that has been there as part of the solution and is now someone that we already have trust with that just so happens to be running to represent us as well.
Okay, so if I went to one of those neighborhoods where it was either like a Hispanic or Black population and I said, what has Joe done for your community? Tell me like a notable thing that you think they would tell me.
Well, I think if you were to look at a lot of areas, a lot of that would be on the small business development side. So, supporting local small businesses through the program that I used to manage, we helped start probably about 400 new small businesses across the entire state of Colorado. That's actually probably the most recent thing that we would look at. In other areas, like say with the schools, you go back to the work through Rotary of engaging with K through 12 and helping with their reading programs and those sorts of things. And then there are some other groups, particularly one known as the Men of Influence, that is really involved with the crime prevention and youth mentorship. And I've been participating with them in those events. And really those are just about showing up. And a great example is they volunteered to serve Christmas dinner at one of our local homeless shelters and invited me to go along with them. And so I showed up and again, I kind of feel guilty about talking about it now because I didn't go for the photo op. I went to support them and to support our community, and they saw that and they realized that, no, this is someone that's actually here to be able to do. So I think everyone's going to have a different story.
Okay, and I don't mean to harp on it, but like if I were to go to those communities and the things that you just mentioned, like the reading programs, going through the K through 12, the Rotary, the small businesses, do you think that accurately reflects the things that they would tell me are most lacking from the current congressional representative?
I think when you talk to them, they would tell you that our congressional representative hasn't done anything and that he's never been seen in those communities and wouldn't be seen in those communities.
So, okay, so you think that presence is probably the thing that they're lacking the most?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. And then my last question, because I know it's pretty late. About 90 million people did not vote for the Democratic or Republican frontrunner in the 2024 contest. What have you been doing to move those people to vote, even if you or the next presidential candidate doesn't fully align with their own values?
Mm-hmm. For us, it's been about making, so when we go back to our conversation around the No Kings rallies and seeing this surge of, in the past 2 years, we've seen 3 of the top 5 largest protests in Colorado Springs history take place. that is a level of voter engagement that you've got to continue to build on and encourage people to have those conversations. And continue people to just not sit there and just don't just show up and yell, but now take that energy to the ballot box and be able to do that. As a campaign, we have brought on the ability to do a voter registration drive. And so going out and finding those folks that aren't registered to vote and engaging with them directly. And I think more than anything, when it comes to my role as a candidate, it's also about positioning myself as giving someone something to vote for. Because what you hear time and time again, that 90 million people, or here in El Paso County, it was that 12% that I talked about earlier. Those are the folks that sit there and say, I don't like either of these two candidates, and now so I'm going to vote for my lesser of two evils, or I'm not going to vote at all. And that's the thing where when we give somebody the ability to affirm what they're voting for, I'm voting for that person. And you do that by meeting them where they're at and by really focusing on a strategy of that presence. And I think that that's something that we've seen. And again, where the party has not done a great job of saying, hey, we're in a room full of Democrats. This is great. It's like, well, that's great, guys, but that's not the majority of people that need to vote for you. Mm-hmm. You've got to be in these other areas as well and show how you are living by your values so that people are looking at that and saying, that's the person I want to vote for, and not just the lesser of two evils.
And so when you say presence, when you say presence, you're talking about being there to listen, to hear what their issues are, right? And to see what their need is by just having them show you or having them tell you what their need is, instead of you like just bursting in as the savior and saying, oh, I know what you need, fine people, and here you go. And, I feel like I get the sense when you're talking about the things that you've done in the various communities and programs, and you talk about being present, you're talking about that too, just being there as somebody who is in leadership, as somebody who is running for office and wants to be their representative, that you're showing them, look, I will show up. Right. Even after even if I get elected, I will still show up to be of service in this community.
So one of the fun things that we've done, so our current representative has only done the telephone town halls. So he won't even appear on camera. He has these kind of they're pretty lame, telephone town halls. You dial in. And so we started saying, we'd just say, hey, listen, we're going to be at this location physically. If you want to come and listen with us, I'll give you my answer alongside his answer. And then we would actually go, and then I would do a podcast afterwards and do the same thing. Like, hey, here's the questions that came up. Here's how he answered. Here's my response to that. The physical presence of being in those different spaces and showing up. And there was a particular group where they were not expecting someone like me to be there. And I'm being vague because of the privacy that this group wanted to have as part of this conversation. So please, I'm not being deceptive. I'm respecting this group's desire for privacy. But, came in and spent 2 hours listening to the concerns of this community that felt that because of the way that this election cycle has came out, that their needs were not being talked about. Their rights were not being talked about. And the fact that I was just willing to sit there and listen meant the world to them. And I saw it for days after the fact that some people would come like, hey, I heard you went to that thing. And that means, and it was echoing through. And so people see that. And kind of a funnier story is the other day I was at my son's baseball game. And as he gets up to bat, he's got his name on the back of his shirt. And this woman kind of out into nowhere, she goes, Reagan, isn't that the guy that's running for, I see his signs all over the place. And she looks over at me and she's like, do you know that? I was like, wait, you're him. And I was like, yeah. But it's that sort of momentum that you see when people see you out there, not just as someone that's trying to get all the photo ops and the pictures, but someone that's actually trying to listen to concerns and recognize the fact that, yeah, I have a lot of opinions, I have a lot of thoughts on policy, but I also recognize I can be wrong. Mm-hmm. And the only way that we're going to move forward with this is taking that opportunity to be transparent, to have those conversations. And I say the stuff that we do as a campaign is all about the way that we're going to lead as well. I am the only campaign that does not require someone to register prior to attending an event. Early in this, and this goes back to our disability question too, because so many people will sit there and say, oh, scan this QR code and we'll give you the address to the, and register, and then we'll give you the address to the event. And I said, no, we're not doing that, because one, either people who aren't tech savvy or individuals with disability, that's a barrier. We don't want to do that. And two, there's no reason that I should create any barrier for someone to figure out where I am or where they're going to find me. And I think that that's just one of those small commitments that we've made early in this campaign that we've stuck to say, no, that's the way that we're able to lead.
I can appreciate that you think about that, because a lot of people don't, especially, I mean, you know, we're all sort of in middle age, but, you know, you're thinking about the full spectrum of people who may need to talk to you and need their voices heard. So that's good. And I think that's what Lisa was touching on too, is listening with the intent of really, really understanding is just huge. Not listening to be superficial, but listening for the full understanding of how we can best have our voices amplified. That's the whole point, in my opinion, of a congressperson, is like amplifying your constituents' voices. So I'm hoping that you can do that. And I would love to, unless there's any objection, I'd love to let us wrap this up and let you get some rest, Joe. I know that you have a lot going on before your primary, which again, I'll remind everybody is coming up on June 30th, correct? And as you said, mail-in ballots need to be at the facility by the date, not postmarked by the date. 7 p.m. on the 30th. Right, exactly. So as we're wrapping up here, how can people who want to support you, how can we support you? Do you have a website that you want to drop? What else do you want to go ahead and plug for yourself?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, follow us here on TikTok. We do put a lot of content out there. It's actually really funny. I was at my son's Boy Scout meeting the other day, and all of the scouts were talking about, they were doing public speaking, and I guess they came across some of my content on TikTok, and so I was the talk of the scouts of what public speaking actually can look like. I also have a question there about name recognition, and we do have great name recognition, and it's not just about the guys running for office, but when we have canvassers out there and they're talking to folks on the doors, people are like, oh yeah, I met him at this thing. Not politically, like I met him at Rotary, I met him at baseball, my kids go to school with him, I saw him at this fundraiser, he was at this thing. And so that name recognition extends not just beyond the political events, but really into so many different elements of the community. That is huge. ReaganForColorado.com is our website. The handle Reagan for Colorado we use across all of our social media channels. Please do follow that. I am running against a multimillionaire, and they are well funded, and we are winning this race. But we need to make sure that we're getting in front of those friends of our neighbors. So whatever support people can provide, whether that's sharing, whether that is liking, if you are in district and you want to come volunteer, we have huge groups of canvassers go out every day. Be involved. Or as I always like to say, right, the best thing you can do is talk about me behind my back, because no one ever changed their vote because of a television commercial. But when you have an experience where you are able to sit down and have that more in-depth conversation with a candidate, the back and forth like we're having today, you can bring that to your friends and your network, and that is going to change people's minds. Do not lose sight of how valuable your voice is. So use it. Use it to make positive change. If you like me or don't like me, it doesn't matter, but use your voice for positive change in this election cycle.
Hey, listen, I know they want us to be quiet, but I am way too stubborn to do that. So I'll be talking about you behind your back. You can count on me.
That was great.
All right, Lisa, did you have
patience with all the technical challenges as well?
Thank you again for your persistence.
I'm so glad that it worked out. And I just have one question for you, Joe. Will you come back and see us again after your primary, after you win your primary, so that we can talk again? But that's the only question I had, is if you would come back and see us after you win your primary, just to talk some more about maybe your strategy, because right now, tonight, we just really focused on your platform, your plans and all that stuff. What I want to hear about next time is like your plan for beating your Republican opponent and what your strategy is. Talk about Democratic messaging and the whole establishment of it all and the leadership of it all, like get into all that good stuff.
Already looking forward to it. Already looking forward to it.
All right. So am I. So am I, Joe. Thank you so much for your time tonight and for giving us so much of it, because I know you're so busy. It was an absolute pleasure. Okay. Well, thanks, Joe. Have a good night.
Thank you, Joe.
Yep. Appreciate you so much.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.